For more than a decade, from the late 1970s to the early 1990s, an invisible specter loomed over the forests and railway lines of the Rostov region in the Soviet Union. People would later call it an era of terrifying silence. Children failed to return home after school. Young women vanished without a trace after stepping off night trains. And when the first crime scenes were finally uncovered, society was forced to confront a chilling truth. They were facing a creature with a human form, but a mind that had completely decayed. He was not a madman roaming the streets with a weapon in hand. He was a teacher, a supply clerk, a devoted husband and father, a diligent civil servant, always willing to help strangers at a bus stop. Yet behind the thick glasses and respectable appearance lay a dark history, at least 52 lives taken, most of them belonging to the vulnerable. He did not stop at killing. He committed acts of extreme depravity, violating the bodies of his victims in ways that even the most seasoned investigators would later recall with a shudder. How did a rigid security system allow such a predator to evade capture for 12 years? How did contradictions in biology and blood type inadvertently become his shield? And finally, what kind of suffocating battle of wits forced the monster of Rostov to bow at last? On October 16, 1936, in what was then Soviet Ukraine, a child was born at the very center of a historical maelstrom. Chikatilo was not raised on love, but on humanity's most primal fear, the fear of being consumed. In the shadows of ramshackle thatched huts, his mother, Anna, planted a curse in the fragile mind of young Andrei, a curse named Stepan. She told him that his older brother, Stepan, had been kidnapped by starving neighbors, killed, and eaten as a means of survival during the Holodomor famine. Although later investigators would find no records proving that this brother ever existed, for Andrei, the story was an unquestionable truth. It shaped a warped worldview from his earliest years, that human beings are inherently brutal creatures, and that life itself can only be sustained through the violation of others. Privacy was a luxury concept for the Chikatilo family. 4 people were crammed into a single-room shack, forcing Andrei to share a bed with his parents. There, he not only witnessed the brutality of grinding poverty, but also had to confront a deeply humiliating biological affliction. Chikatilo suffered from a congenital brain lesion, which caused him to frequently lose control of his bladder while sleeping. Instead of empathy, every morning for Andrei began with a series of punishing beatings from his mother. The physical pain and bodily shame fused together, creating an extremely dangerous psychological, compressed spring. The image of his mother, who had always been the symbol of authority and punishment, being violated shattered whatever remaining faith Andrei had in the family's ability to protect him. This translation stays faithful to the original wording and tone, while using clear, idiomatic American English. The details align with well-documented accounts of Andrei Chikatilo's early life from credible biographical sources. For example, his Wikipedia summary drawing from Cullen's The Killer Department and other references, including the shared bed, chronic bedwetting punished by his mother, his father's wartime disappearance, and the widely reported, though speculative in exact details, wartime rape leading to his sister's birth. December 1978. For Andrei Chikatilo, this was not just the end of a year, but the end of an era of repression. His mother, Anna Chikatilo, the woman who had been both the source of his humiliating beatings and the final chain binding him to social order, had passed away. From a psychological analysis perspective, his mother's death removed the last safety latch in the mind of a man already burdened with congenital brain damage and profound self-loathing. Once the fear of punishment from his mother vanished, the monster beneath the facade of an intellectual began seeking peace in the most brutal way possible. On December 21st, 1978, just days after his mother's funeral, Chikatilo committed his first documented assault. The victim was Yelena Zakotnova, a 9-year-old girl. He approached and lured her to a roadside shack, then led her into a nearby forest. There, his chronic impotence, the defect that had tormented him for decades, surfaced once again. Instead of achieving normal gratification, he found perverse satisfaction through the use of a sharp weapon to take the victim's life. He unleashed all the pent-up rage from his past onto the innocent girl's body, a desperate attempt to assert power and release his own deep-seated shame. This case could have ended the nightmare right at its beginning. Chikatilo was actually suspected and even seen with Yelena. However, a catastrophic mistake by the investigative system occurred. Under pressure to quickly identify the perpetrator, authorities focused on another man instead. This costly error inadvertently became a free pass for the killer. Chikatilo realized that, hiding behind the guise of a gentle intellectual and a model literature teacher, he could remain invisible to the law. The silence of the media and the complacency of the investigative system at the time created a dark void for him to operate freely. He began moving around, changing teaching locations, waiting and stalking at train stations. The route from Shakhty to Rostov started to be stained with heartbreaking traces that no one could have anticipated. The monster had escaped its cage, and the 12 years of terror officially began from here. For 12 years, from 1978 to 1990, the Rostov region and surrounding areas were not only shrouded in the bitter cold of Russian winters, but also by an invisible specter. It was a period when silence was sometimes more terrifying than screams. While the Soviet authorities of the time tended to suppress reports of extreme crimes such as serial murder or sexual assault in the media, in the shadows, rumors began to spread like a virus. People whispered to each other about a werewolf or some monstrous entity prowling the forests, taking lives and leaving victims' bodies mutilated beyond recognition. The lack of transparency in information inadvertently created a perfect shield for Andrei Chikatilo, who was living a double life that no one could have suspected. Look at his facade: an electrical engineer, a husband with 2 children, and especially a Russian literature teacher with a prestigious university degree. There's an ironic truth that's almost unbelievable. Despite frequent accusations of improper behavior toward students, Chikatilo managed to keep his teaching position for nearly a decade. He used his intellectual label and his awkward, timid demeanor to disarm everyone's instincts for caution. His battlefield wasn't the city centers, but public transportation hubs, train stations and bus stops. There, he patiently stalked the most vulnerable targets, children and teenagers. With a leather briefcase in hand, he approached them like a kindly uncle, offering promises of money, toys, drugs, or candy to lure victims into the windbreak forests along the roads. Once the forest door closed behind them, the real monster awakened. Chikatilo didn't just kill to take lives. He committed unspeakable acts to fill the void of his chronic impotence. Each victim bore a brutal signature. He often targeted the eyes of the deceased due to a superstitious belief that the eyes retained the final image of the killer. He carried out extreme mutilation and violation of the body in a desperate search for perverse peace in his soul. By August 1984, the list of those who had perished at his hands had reached 30. Yet the reality of a serial killer's existence was still not made public. In investigative files, he was merely a phantom known as Killer X. Delays in connecting biological clues and negligence in record-keeping allowed the monster another 6 years to continue sowing pain. He moved constantly, from Rostov to Vladimir Oblast, exploiting his job's frequent travel to hunt for new targets. Every stop became a crime scene drenched in red fluids and unsolved mysteries. Chikatilo wasn't just a perpetrator, he was a mistake of nature, challenging every limit of morality and law at the time. How could a man once expelled from the Communist Party for theft at work roam free outside the law for so long? Why were clear biological clues overlooked? We will delve deeper into those costly mistakes and the breathless pursuit in the next chapter. But first, consider the number 52. Not just names on paper, but 52 family tragedies created by the tolerance of silence and Andrei Chikatilo's perfect intellectual disguise. In September 1984, Andrei Chikatilo was stopped at a bus station in Rostov after being spotted approaching and soliciting a woman. When investigators opened his leather briefcase, a horrifying kit was revealed. A razor-sharp kitchen knife, a length of rope, a towel, and a jar of Vaseline. To anyone with logical thinking, these were indisputable tools of a predator on the hunt. He was placed as the prime suspect in the series of heartbreaking cases occurring repeatedly at train stations. However, this was precisely when the biological knot emerged, serving as a protective charm that allowed the monster to roam free outside the law for another 6 years. Chikatilo's blood test showed he belonged to blood type A. Yet, the biological traces collected from the victims' bodies at the crime scenes appeared to belong to a completely different blood group. This deadly contradiction led investigators at the time to a mistaken conclusion. Chikatilo could not be the perpetrator. He was released just a few weeks later, despite being expelled from the Communist Party for theft at his workplace. Why was there this discrepancy? Two hypotheses have been proposed to explain this knot. The first suggests it was an administrative or technical error in the preservation and testing of samples from the crime scenes. But the second, more intriguing and rarer, is the phenomenon of the non sequitur, BUN. In about 20% of the population, blood group antigens do not appear in other bodily fluids besides blood. This means that even though Chikatilo had blood type A, the biological traces he left at the scenes might not produce matching results, creating a biological phantom that fooled all the analytical equipment of the era. The deadlock persisted until the appearance of psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky. He compiled a 65-page psychological profile of the individual he called Killer X. Bukhanovsky asserted that the perpetrator was a sadist suffering from chronic impotence who had to violate victims' bodies to compensate for his biological shortcomings. More importantly, he pointed out that the killer had a job requiring frequent travel by public transportation based on the pattern of the crimes. Based on this psychological map, Operation Forest Strip, Lesopolosa, was launched on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of undercover police were deployed across train stations. And finally, in November 1990, the knot was unraveled. Chikatilo was stopped just as he emerged from a forested area where victim Svetlana Korostik had been found. This time, there were no mistakes. Under the pressure of psychological evidence and master interrogator Burakov's questioning, the monster bowed his head and confessed to the truth about 57 crimes he had committed. Science can err, but logic and perseverance do not. The biological knot that once protected him was ultimately severed by the combination of criminal psychology and the tireless efforts of those seeking justice. But when the perfect intellectual mask fully fell away, what unfolded in the courtroom truly sent chills through the world. After 12 relentless years of darkness, costly investigative mistakes, and immeasurable pain, we finally reach the conclusion of the Andrei Chikatilo case file. But this was no peaceful ending. It was a direct confrontation between a rotten personality and the scales of justice in a nation undergoing turbulent transformation. On April 14, 1992, the city of Rostov was shaken by the opening of the trial for the man dubbed the Butcher of Rostov. For millions of people in the former Soviet Union, this was the moment when the rawest truth would be laid bare under the light. But before any testimony was spoken, the first image that struck everyone's eyes was the sturdy iron cage surrounding the defendant. This was an unprecedented arrangement in legal history. Andrei Chikatilo was not seated at the usual defendant's bench. He was locked inside like a dangerous entity requiring complete isolation. Why such extreme security measures? The authorities understood that without those thick iron bars, the overwhelming rage of the relatives of the 52 victims would have overwhelmed the killer right there on the spot. In the courtroom, fathers and mothers who had waited for justice for more than a decade wanted nothing more than to rush in and punish the man who had so cruelly taken their children's lives the moment he appeared. The cage not only protected society from him, but more importantly, protected his life so the trial could proceed to its end. Entering the courtroom, Andrei Chikatilo did not choose to bow his head in remorse or remain silent in admission of guilt. Instead, he launched into a series of bizarre, almost insane behaviors, turning the solemn courtroom into a stage of chaos. From a script editing and criminal psychology analysis perspective, it was clear this was a clumsily staged performance with one sole purpose: to feign madness in order to escape punishment. At times, right in the middle of the trial, while the prosecutor was reading the hundreds of pages indictment detailing his depraved acts, Chikatilo suddenly did the unacceptable. He stripped off his clothing, exposing his body to the shock and disgust of the entire court panel and the public present. He shouted that he was not a man with deviant sexual tendencies toward males, then immediately followed with delusional claims that he was pregnant and needed care like a woman nursing a child. He even declared he was breastfeeding, a desperate attempt to prove a loss of behavioral and cognitive control. He repeatedly interrupted the trial proceedings by suddenly bursting into song in the middle of sessions, just as families of the victims were sobbing while recounting their irreplaceable losses. At times he appeared bored, slumping against the iron bars as if dozing off. At others he exploded in unprovoked anger, cursing and insulting everyone around him. For the judicial panel, this was an extreme test of patience. But for forensic psychiatric experts, every movement and word was a piece of the puzzle dissecting the true nature of the monster. The defense team made every effort to assert that Chikatilo suffered from schizophrenia and lacked criminal responsibility for his actions. If this hypothesis had been accepted, the man who had taken dozens of lives could have ended up in a treatment facility rather than facing the death penalty. However, forensic science was not so easily deceived. A panel of leading psychiatrists and criminal psychologists was appointed to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the defendant. Their conclusion put an end to any possibility of feigned insanity. Andrei Chikatilo was fully capable of understanding and bearing legal responsibility for his actions. The experts pointed out that every step of his crimes over 12 years, from selecting train stations, luring victims with candy or toys, to choosing isolated windbreak forests to strike, demonstrated meticulous, cold, and extremely cunning calculation. He was a sadist of average intelligence who was fully aware of the illegality of his behavior and always tried to cover his tracks. The bizarre performances in court were merely a last-ditch effort to evade punishment for his long list of innocent victims. Throughout the lengthy trial, the court had to hear detailed accounts of the 52 proven murders. From the first case involving 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova in 1978 to the final victims in 1990. The descriptions of how he used sharp objects to mutilate the deceased bodies or targeted the victim's eyes due to superstitious beliefs thickened the courtroom air with grief and horror. When Dr. Bukhanovsky took the witness stand, He did more than read a report. He reconstructed the portrait of a distorted personality from the most fragmented psychological pieces. Buchanovsky explained to the court that Chikatilo was not simply a murderer. He was an entity warped by childhood traumas of famine, family betrayal, and biological defects from an early age. Buchanovsky's testimony was a sharp blade that severed any remaining hope of acquittal, as he demonstrated that all of Chikatilo's actions followed a tight, ruthless internal logic. In total, 21 males and 31 females had been lost forever at the hands of this man hiding behind an intellectual mask. The blood type discrepancy that once saved him in 1984 was finally clarified through the rare biological phenomenon of the non-sequitur. On October 14, 1992, the historic verdict was pronounced. Andrei Chikatilo was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to the maximum penalty, death. Cheers mixed with belated tears echoed through the courtroom. Justice had finally arrived, though it had traveled a long road filled with mistakes and the spilled blood of so many innocents. The period awaiting execution revealed Chikatilo's extreme selfishness and perversion. During his months in solitary confinement, his psyche was a chaotic mix of arrogance and fear. He repeatedly sent petitions for clemency, calling himself a scientific legacy that needed to be preserved for study. He showed no sign of confronting oblivion or remorse for the dozens of lives he had destroyed. The chronic impotence that once drove his crimes now turned into impotence in the face of impending death. He tried to negotiate, attempting to sell whatever remained of himself in exchange for survival. Finally, on February 14, 1994, the fateful morning arrived. Andrei Chikatilo was led to the execution site. Even in his final moments, his deviance remained unchanged. His last words before the sentence was carried out by a strong physical blow to the head were haunting and grotesque. "Don't damage my brain. The Japanese want to buy it for a high price." The shot that day officially ended the existence of the Beast of Rostov. Andrei Chikatilo's life was over, but his file remains a stark reminder that monsters can be forged from the scars of history and the indifference of society. He departed, taking his darkest secrets into the earth. But for the families of the 52 victims, justice was fully served, closing one of the most horrifying chapters in world criminal history.